Molly. I'm going to show you how I work with gouache today. Okay, so first things first, I use a different kind of gouache than your typical kind of gouache. This gouache is a lot more water resistant than what you would normally expect, so just be warned about that. You definitely have to use a special kind of palette, which I'm going to go over for you guys. So yeah, basically the longer it stays dry, the harder it is to rework. So anyways, I'm going to talk about my supplies that I use, and then we're going to go into a time lapse. I'm going to discuss the techniques that I use with this gouache, and we're just going to kind of watch how I work. And hopefully you guys learned something today. I don't know, I've never done this before, so thanks for watching, and let's go. Alright, so I'm going to talk about the supplies that I use. So right here I've got my Masterson Sta-Wet palette. It's really messy right now, but it's awesome for the gouache because it keeps it really moist. It's obviously staying really wet. So I love it. It's got this sponge underneath that keeps it wet, and that's super awesome. I also use this gouache here that I talked about earlier. It's got an acrylic base basically with a matte medium added to it. It's somewhat water resistant, but the longer it dries, the more difficult it is to rework. So just be aware of that when you're using it. It works really great though if you're trying to get really solid colors, if you're trying to get really vibrant colors. I love it for that. So yep, highly recommend it. These are the brushes that I use. Most of them are Princeton brushes. They're pretty cheap, but they're really awesome, I think. I have to get them every now and again though, because they'll start to break or the ends will fringe, but I really enjoy them. I'm sure there's better ones out there, but they work for me. Alright, so that's about it for supplies. You guys had some questions about mixing colors. So when I mix my colors, I use a palette knife right here. So basically when I'm mixing my colors, I'll take my palette knife and I'll dip it into one color and place it somewhere else on the palette. And then I'll take my other color that I'm mixing and place it there and just mix it until it creates the color that I want. I like to create a few different tints if I can. It kind of sets the stage as far as the colors for the painting. So the other stuff that I'm going to talk about as far as like applying paint to the paper, how much water I use, how I make my outlines, etc. That's all going to be in the time lapse here. So keep watching, and I guess we're going to move on to the time lapse. Alright, bye! Hello everyone, so here I'm going to be answering some questions that you guys had about gouache and then just talking about my overall process for painting this piece here. So this is a gala, it's just some sort of Australian parrot. So yeah, I'll just get started on my process. So I began by doing a watercolor wash here as a base. It was just an overall pink wash to kind of get the tone of the painting going. I really like using watercolor as a base wash just because of the way it feels. As I start to paint the gouache over it later on, it doesn't feel like I have all these layers of paint. After that, I started adding some gouache just to highlight some areas on the bird. I did like mostly the face and the tail there, even though most of the tail is going to be blue. It just gives me an idea of where I want my light to be. So now I've started adding the first outline to the peonies. At this point in the painting, I'm not worrying so much about how thick my lines are compared to the other lines in the painting. Eventually I'm going to come back in there with some other paint and kind of carve out some areas so I can create some better thick and thin lines. It creates a cool effect with gouache as well that I really like. And as y'all can see, I don't often spend time in one area for very long before I move on to the others. So right here I'm just adding in some of the darker areas to the gala. So here's a closer look at the outlining. As you can see, it's pretty messy, but like I said, I'm going to come in later on with some more paint and clean those lines up a bit. So this is kind of the process of how I work. I come in with some washes, I do my outlines, and then I come in with more paint and clean up those outlines. It's a lot of layering and kind of a long process, but it's really fun, and I really like how it looks in the end. So yeah. I'm just going to keep working on these outlines here for a little bit, so I'll let you guys go until I get to another section. I'm beginning to add some details to the bird. So I like to work from light to dark, so I start out with a really washed out light pink. Here I start to make some little W-like shapes to outline the feathers. After I paint in some of the details, I lay down another wash of gouache, this time more vibrant and much more true to the colors that I want out of this painting. At this point, I'm still using a lot of water with the paint, and I'm making sure that I just very lightly touch down on the paper where I think the shadows are going to be. Occasionally painting some areas even darker where I know there's going to be a lot of shadow. After the other washes have dried, I start to add in finer details to the face. I love adding in details to the face of whatever I'm working on early on because it gets me really excited for the rest of the illustration. I'll also note, when I add in some of the finer details, I use less water to draw attention to that area and to make everything look sharper. Now I've started painting in the peonies. Here you can see how I carve out the outline to create thick and thin lines. Also, as I'm painting in the petals, I make sure to add a bit of color variation here and there between them to make things look a little more interesting. I'm not too worried about messing up here in case I go over one of my outlines too far, because I'm going to go back eventually and touch up some of the outlines once more at the very end of the painting, or I'll just fix them as I go. As the petals dry, I go back and add even more details to the face of the gala. I also start to add in shadows here and there, and then brighten some areas too. This is the area where I want to have a lot of contrast because it's the face of the animal, therefore it's kind of the focal point of the painting. I'm also tightening up some of the details on the feathers with some darker hints of blue and purple. I try to make sure to add these darker areas on areas where I think there would be a crease, fold, or shadow. In college I was taught that these areas are sometimes called Y spots. In life drawing you'll kind of see them in folds of the skin like the elbows or the legs like the back of the knee. In this case you'll see them a lot in the feathers here. There'll be an area where the feathers will come together and it looks almost like the letter Y. These are the areas where I really like to darken the color and punch the contrast. Now I'm going to start adding in some of the highlights on the feathers. I'm coming in with way thicker paint here to really brighten up those spots. So I'm using a lot less water with the brush, but then afterwards I come in with just only water on the brush and I just scrub those areas out a bit. Doing this softens things up a bit, and because the gouache is fairly water resistant, you don't have to worry about it fading away. Now I'm going back to the flower petals and touching things up a bit. I'm darkening things up and lightening some areas as well, just to create a little bit more contrast within them. I'm also touching up my outline here. I'm making some lines thinner and keeping some lines thick, just to make it a little more interesting. So yeah, at this point I'm mostly just putting in the final details here, so I'm going to let the rest of this video run. If you have any questions or want to see more, leave a comment below because I'd love to hear what you guys think. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.